Roger Duncan, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thanks, David. It's great to be on the show. Really, real honor.
Well, I feel honored. I feel humbled by the book that you've written, which is, it's not just some nature boy, nouveau hippie railing against modernization and romanticizing the world of nature. Instead, you paint a picture or of a path by which we can find ourselves today with our entire developmental heritage in a place where we're healing that rift between ourselves and nature.
Right.
And you've done the hard work not only of conceptualizing and redreaming the world in that way, but you've also extensively referenced research. I was amazed that you've got tons of references in there. And so it's not just kind of a romanticized vision. It is a vision, but not a romanticized one.
Yeah.
So congratulations. What more can I say?
It's been it's taken a long time. Lots gone into it, and I have to say, I was really inspired by listening to all the people on Shrink Wrap who'd written books, over the years, and thought,
yeah.
I can do that. I can do that. So,
good for you.
You've influenced this book, Dr. Dave, in a lot of things. A lot of the references, and some of the people you've spoken to, have really touched me and inspired me. So thanks for that.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a function of Shrink Wrap Radio that I haven't quite heard expressed in that way before, providing inspiration to write your own book, and providing you with resource people. Well, the scope of your book is so broad that there's no way that we can wrap our arms around it, so to speak, for it within an hour, the time of an hour, to really get it all. So I thought that a good way for what I would hope for this is for you and I to have an interesting conversation, basically.
Yeah,
that's kind of rooted in the book and rooted in your life experience. And I thought that a good way for us to jump into that would be to have you read from chapter 8 towards the end of the book. You've got a long paragraph called Conclusion.
Okay.
And that we can use that as a springboard. I'll ask you questions about it and we'll fill in information. And so I ask our listeners forbearance as you read probably what is a longer paragraph than I should have had you read, but it's got so much in it. It's so meaty that
good.
Everybody listen hard, because this is the framing of everything else that we're going to be talking about.
Right.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I'll read it slowly because there's quite a lot in it, I think.
Yes.
Okay. So taking the long view of human development that includes the whole of our indigenous history can open up a new way to see the world and break through the socially constructed boundaries of the medical and mechanistic perspective. This way of learning to recognize the imaginal and creatorial aspects of the world opens up the possibility of working with nature and the human mind in a way that is more ecological and systemic. An imaginal perspective provides a rationale for the use of nature-based developmental wheels that offer a completely different quality of mental health development that can complement contemporary perspectives. The use of nature-based developmental tools helps focus curiosity on the quality of underlying attachment patterns, the integration and mastery of the body, and the threshold experience of systemic phase change or soul encounter. This nature-based perspective also invites us to build cultures where adults embrace developmental elderhood through the process of initiation and subsequent integration of their life experiences, enabling them to support children and adolescents. The next task seems to be the mastery of the imaginal and creatorial perspectives as described by Bateson and Corbin, which provides insight into how the systems of nature and the human mind work together and bring this understanding into mainstream weird culture. Embracing a systemic eco-psychological view of human development alongside professional training allows for a new narrative of how human beings and nature are connected. This challenges the weird cultural tyranny of directed thinking that cannot recognize the subtlety of the unity between mind and nature, so unconsciously perpetrates and perpetuates patterns of behavior that are unhealthy and destructive to both nature and the human soul. This book is an invitation to join the terrible and beautiful dance between nature and the indigenous mind.
Yeah, good job. A plus as a reader.
Thanks.
Let's give a little bit of context for this before we start pulling it apart. You're a systems guy. You've been involved with systems theory for some time, and you have a therapy practice that you call the approach systemic. Say it for me. What's
systemic family therapy? Systemic family therapy. Basically, in the UK, you can train as a systemic family therapist, which is based on Bateson's ideas and how to work systemically with families, organizations, individuals. And what I've done is I've extended that to include the ideas of nature, because originally I was a biologist, as was Bateson, or Bateson's father was, in fact.
Okay, so you're a systems guy. You're also a nature guy. You mentioned the biology background, but you've gone into nature in a big way as a wilderness trip leader, et cetera. And you've done nature adventures, I guess, both as a group leader and maybe on your own all over the world, including working with indigenous peoples. Tell us about that. And you must have some great stories in there.
Yeah, well, I think that was, when I was in my 20s, I traveled through the Middle East and into Africa. And there I met, I was lucky enough to meet indigenous people, Bedouin, and particularly in the Sudan, indigenous tribes, which were pretty much untouched by Western world, what I call what Jared Diamond calls the weird world. So, I had a sense of touching into something which was our own indigenous history, which was very healing in a way.
Yeah, you use that word weird, and you credit Jared Diamond with it, and it was in the passage that you read too. So let's expand that a little. What's meant by the weird world? Because it's not what it sounds like.
No, I mean it is. I mean what he talks about, Jared Diamond, in his book, which is called The World Until Yesterday, I think, which is about the difference between Western culture and indigenous culture, and particularly the time difference. I think ecopsychologists recognize that actually we're all kind of displaced indigenous people. And Jared Diamond coins the term weird, which is Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic, to describe the particular period we're living through in history, which is very, very short compared to how long we've been living as non-weird or indigenous cultures, or cultures which reference nature in a way that we've kind of forgotten.
I think people who take psychedelics can easily identify with something I've been looking back at recently, have the experience that we live in a weird culture.
Yes.
But normally we think of ourselves as normal, our culture as the baseline of normal, and we look at indigenous peoples and the way they think and the things they do as weird. So that's the part that the word is a little bit differently than people might imagine.
Yeah.
And have you also traveled on other continents as well?
I've traveled a little bit in America, but that's more recently because my kids are there.
Okay.
That was my main contact with indigenous people was really in Africa and the Middle East, in Syria, in fact.
Now you said something about time, and are you referring to the sense of time that the indigenous person has a different sense of time than the Western industrialized person does? Is that what you were getting at?
I think we're living in a time, in weird culture, as it were. We're living in a time which is very, very, very strange, very weird in relation to how humans have lived in contact with the world for 99.97% of our existence, really. So, and we've constructed a way of looking at the world, which is actually not really working that well. It's not really working for our mental health. It's not really working for the environment. And I suppose when I studied, systemic family therapy, what I came across was Bateson was suggesting there was this Western way of looking at the world was actually part of what he calls an epistemological error, an error in how we think about things. And it took me quite a while to figure out what he was talking about, because he's well known for being very difficult to understand, Gregory Bateson. He's very dense.
Yeah. Well, let's dip back into the passage that you read. As I say, a kind of springboard here. I have to find it on my computer. I had it. So you say, taking the long view of human development that includes the whole of our indigenous history. That's what you just talked about. And let's see, taking the long view of human development that includes the whole of our indigenous history can open the way we see the world and break through the socially constructed boundaries of the medical or mechanistic perspective. So by saying medical or mechanistic in the same sentence there, I think kind of combines two of your main drives, because you're a psychotherapist, and there we struggle with the medical model.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole mechanistic perspective that we find ourselves contained within.
Yeah.
So you're saying that if we get in touch with that long history, that it can help to heal us. You go on to say, for that reason, learning to recognize the imaginal and creatural.
Yeah.
I've never run across the word creatural, but I guess it's referring to our creatureness. That learning to recognize the imaginal and creatural aspects of the world opens up the possibility of working with nature and the human mind that is more ecological and systemic. So you talk quite a bit about the imaginal and how that seems to be closely allied to our indigenous heritage.
I think so.
Yeah, expand on what you mean by imaginal and what that connection is to the other elements that you're talking about here.
What I mean, the imaginal, as far as I understand from what I've read, the imaginal, the phrase imaginal was coined by Henri Corbin, a French philosopher, and it seems he was one of the influences. He was a contemporary of Jung, and it seems like it's possible that influenced Jung's idea on this idea of the collective unconscious, this kind of invisible force that was connecting things. He's very clear, Henri Corbin, about the imaginal, which he discovered in Islamic literature, and he says what he discovered there was a lost continent of language describing a way of experiencing the world which we've completely forgotten in the West. And what he says is it's non-conceptual. In other words, you can't conceptualize it, and it's invisible. So, from our Western point of view, you think, well, if it's non-conceptual, you can't see it and you can't think it. What is it? Well, what he's saying is it's connected to the heart. It's connected to our feelings, and it has a quality of being intersubjective. So, as a psychotherapist, we're quite often working with that space, the intersubjective heart space, and quite often he also describes that it's in what I've been reading, this hermeneutic quality, this quality of emergence that comes within that space. And again, we recognize that in psychotherapy quite often. And what he's saying is that outside of a Western culture, particularly in the Islamic culture, but also you see that if you look at what indigenous people are saying, there's a way of encountering nature which is intersubjective and emergent. There's an emergent quality to it.
So I'm assuming that imagination is part of this. I mean, it seems like imaginal is somehow working with the idea of imagination. And I'm imagining myself as, I mean, I think there's some way in which immersion in nature evokes this imaginal experience that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, the link I made was with Gregory Bateson, who calls it creatoral. He describes the same thing, but he calls it creatura, and that's what he uses in here. That's what he urges us to use in understanding nature and therapy, actually, the human mind.
So I'm imagining myself wandering around in nature, and if I actually lived there instead of coming out of this world, but even as a modern person, if we go on a retreat or something, there's a way in which nature becomes alive, and a kind of, I guess what's usually in a pejorative way, they talk about animism, where we begin to imagine or experience nature as speaking to us in some ways.
Yeah. And
say more about that, because you've lived with these indigenous people. And what did you observe? What did you experience? How did your own experience of reality change?
Well, I think my experience in being with indigenous people is they were surrounded by nature most of the time. Everything they encountered had most of the things they encountered had a natural origin, whereas in our culture, we're surrounded by man-made things, human-made things the whole time. So we're kind of self-referencing all the time. Whereas actually, when you spend time in nature, particularly when you do something like vision fast or wilderness experience, what happens is you're surrounding your mind by natural objects, by natural experiences, and has a very different effect, has an emergent effect. We also know from a lot of the neuroscience now that it calms us down, takes us out of our head, gets us into our body, slows down our autonomic nervous system. And when you do something like a vision fast, when you open up a ritual space, then you get insights. You get somewhat like psychotherapy, but the therapist it's happening between you and nature. There's a communication that happens. And again, this is what indigenous people have been telling us for a long time. And I suppose because I was trained as a biologist, a rational biologist initially, I found that hard to believe. I couldn't really get my head around that. But by being able to get out of your head, being able to get away from that rational way of thinking and embrace an imaginal perspective, then that opens up other possibilities. And there's a difference between the imaginal, as Henri Corbin describes it, and Gregory Bateson describes it, and imagination. Imagination is something that we make up, like a fantasy, whereas the imaginal is something that emerges between. It has a synchronistic quality that we can sometimes get if we spend time in nature, or again in a therapeutic relationship. You also get that.
Do you think there's some relationship between dreaming consciousness and this imaginal consciousness?
I think there is. I think the imaginal is, my sense of it is that when we dream, we're touching into the imaginal. And my experience of writing and listening to other writers, my experience of writing the book was, in a sense, because I had a lot of experiences over many years, the book came to me often at night. I'd wake up in the morning and I'd know what I had to write about, and then I just had to write it out. And then rather than it coming out of my head, it came out of a space, a kind of in-between space, which had a very different quality to just thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm remembering when you were describing imaginal at the beginning of our talk, that some of the characteristics ascribed to it as non-conceptual and kind of non-linear, etc., are some of the same sorts of words that are used to describe dreaming consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it has. I think once you get into that space, it has a quality, has a dream-like quality, but you're awake in it.
Yes.
And you're not,
Yeah.
and it's not made up. And again, one of those things, the experiences from being out in nature is where you have synchronistic encounters with animals, which have a significance. They have a symbolic significance or a message for you, which is very difficult to. You can't understand it conceptually very well, because it's coming from a different place. It's coming from that
right.
more of a dreaming, imaginal space. But what Bateson says is that the Creatora has its own rigor, it has its own language that we can learn to read. And again, that's something we're familiar with in psychotherapy. We can learn this kind of in-between language that happens between a therapist and a client.
And also with dreams, we can learn to understand the language of dreams to a large extent. Maybe not completely, but we definitely have some ideas about that. Again, I'm keying into the way our sense of time changes. I know that in this current context in which we live, in my life, as a supposedly retired person, busy all the time. It feels like there's not enough time. And I used to reflect on when I was, and a lot of this is just who I've become, I guess, because back when I was teaching, I realized that it felt like I was constantly telling students, I don't have enough time. I'd like to talk to you about this more, but I don't have time. And I realized I don't have time because I'm too busy telling people that I don't have time. So, so that's a very, very weird Western byproduct. I remember going on wilderness trips. I co-led some rafting trips in Oregon, and it was a marvelous experience. And my job actually was to be to focus people a bit on the psychological, on dreams, and also to lead some yoga. And these were like 5-day trips. So a 5-day trip down the Rogue River. And by day 2 or 3, one of the injunctions, one of the rules was that I told people was, put your watches away, you can't have watches. And I would lose track of time, which is not an easy thing for me to do, but a blissful thing to do in a way. Because I entered this kind of state that you're talking about. And then when somebody made reference to, well, we go back tomorrow, I think I recall actually crying a bit. I felt sad. I wasn't ready to leave that space.
Well, there's, I talk about that transition in the book in terms of a couple of stories I put in there. But I think you're right. I mean, my experience of taking people out in wilderness and being in wilderness myself is that and it's quite well documented, in fact, there's 3-day wilderness effect where you kind of zone into a different time zone. There's a timelessness. But it takes some time to do it. And I think that's really important in a lot of this nature-based work. It's quite difficult to get out of this weird cultural perspective. It does take time. It takes at least 3 days. And then, as you say, coming back is a real shock. You come back into weird culture and you see how racy it is and how unhealthy it is in a way, compared to that kind of blissful state of being out in that timeless zone.
television is another example for me that I can get in my regular life, kind of get into a routine where we watch a fair amount of television. When I come back from a wilderness experience, it's like I call it the ghost box. You know,
Yes.
it's like you're watching ghosts. It's
Yes.
not at all compelling. It's
Yes.
kind of boring. And then I realize as I lose that sense and slip back into weird culture,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
go back to sleep in some sense.
Yes, yes, yeah. And I think that's what I'm encouraging people in the book, is to begin to recognize this and recognize the therapeutic value, the educational value of spending time in nature. Because, you know, and I suppose I wrote the book, as I said, to try and bring some of these more some of these experiences more closely into mainstream culture. You know, I've been lucky enough to be able to do some of these things which other people might not have, because they were in different roles. But they're not, you know, they're quite accessible, really. And I think, you know, I think they should be accessible to more people. So that's really what I'm hoping to encourage through the writing of the book.
Yeah, you mentioned that you've had some dramatic experiences of your own that are in the book, but I had to skip around in the book. So I'd love to hear one of those stories.
Yeah, which one do you have? Do you have something in mind?
No, I'm saying I skipped over a lot of that stuff, so that's missing. I can tell you one idea that did speak to me quite strongly was later on in the book. You talk about the ability for wilderness students who are going off on vision quests and so on to begin to feel safe in nature, to feeling held somehow by nature. Now, to me, that's an intriguing concept, because we're naked, we're naked apes, and, you know, and we are out there, and there are wild animals, and nature can be terribly punitive in some ways. So I want you to talk about that. I mean, that almost sounds like a wonderful, hopeful dream, to feel safe. Excuse me, I'm hitting my microphone with my hand as a gesture. The idea of feeling safe in nature is a compelling idea.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I think in weird culture, in Western culture, we tend to think of, you know, we've constructed a way of experiencing nature, and you know, it's something that I often notice in a lot of these, a lot of the sort of the evolutionary perspective of nature. It's very much, you know, nature's red in tooth and claw. This idea of the survival of the fittest. And that's I'm not. I think that's a slightly socially constructed view, because I'm not sure Indigenous people have this idea that it's all about competition. And I think once you get out into nature and once you go beyond that threshold of 3 or 4 days, then you do begin to connect with nature, because, you know, a lot of our body kind of tunes into that imaginal way of being, because that's how we've lived for, you know, 35,000 generations. It's only recently that we've started watching TV and having iPhones and being in the house all the time. You know, that's a very, very recent way of humans started to live. And you know, when you look at Western culture, you realize there are things about it which aren't going so well. Actually, we're struggling to kind of sort of things out.
Yeah. Let me go back to that last paragraph then. An imaginal perspective provides a rationale for the use of nature-based development wheels, which is, wheels sounds a little mechanistic in that context.
Yeah. I've called them developmental wheels, because they're like mandalas in a sense. And
Oh, that's what you're referring to. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So the developmental wheels are, you know, the ones. The one I start with is the Circle of Courage, which has been developed in the States by Lakota educational psychologists. They set up an organization called, well, the book is called Reclaiming Youth at Risk. And it's a very, very powerful book, which describes human development from a Lakota perspective, a much broader lens than our modern Western lens. And the other two wheels I describe are the four shields, which is used by the School of Lost Borders, which is more of a intrapsychic model. It's a model of what's happening inside of us, but it also mirrors nature because they're connected on that imaginal level in this way of thinking. And
these wheels are not like the wheels on the car, which somehow is where my mechanistic mind went to, but rather, as you say, mandalas or maps
exactly
that describe human development and ways of dealing with the world.
Exactly that. And you can use them on lots of different levels. So, you know, I have, you know, although I'm trained as, you know, as a systemic psychotherapist, I often have these maps in my mind when I'm working with young people, because most of them mark out the importance of a rite of passage for adolescence. And again, if you think about that from a systems theory perspective, what you're looking at is systemic phase change, you know, a radical change from being a child, an early adolescence into adulthood, where things are completely transformed. And some people get that through, you know, I think indigenous cultures all over the world, even in Europe, although they no longer occur in Europe. There's a lot of evidence these things did occur throughout Europe before Christianity. And that was an important way of people becoming adults, of turning their childhood inside out, as it were, and also getting a sense of their own agency, their own purpose in life. So, and that was then socially sanctioned, encouraged by the culture, rather than education and development being socially constructed as it is in our culture. You know, we go to school and we're told what jobs we might want to do that are going to fit into the future that's imagined. But, you know, what's happening now is things are moving so fast that actually the future is unimaginable. You know, the doubling time on all these developmental things is so fast. We can't imagine what kind of society we're going to be living in 20 years time, really, let alone 50 years time.
Yeah, back when I was teaching, one of the ideas I had to get across to students was that they needed to have the most flexible education they could come up with, because the evidence was that they would probably change jobs maybe as many as 7 times in the course of their life.
Exactly.
It's hard to tell a student what to major in.
Well, that's fantastic advice. And you see, what we you know, from the studies of indigenous people, they kept a strong flexibility in their way of seeing the world. They kept a very open view of the world, that enabled them to and it was us, it wasn't them. We were those indigenous people. It enabled humans to manage complex systemic change. And that's what we see in nature all the time. You know, nature is constantly ready for the next change. Whereas when we move into sort of a conceptualization, a mechanical conceptualization of the world and our own psyches, then things get pretty stuck.
Yeah, you know what? I'm still digging to find out more of your own subjective experience. Okay. So tell me about a wilderness trip or vision experience that was most impactful for you, that you remember as most impactful. It may have been the first time, it may have been a subsequent, I don't know.
Okay.
But share something like that with us.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, there's an account, there's a couple of accounts of my own vision quest in the book. One is of being on the there's a certain point in the vision quest where you're encouraged to do a vigil, an all-night vigil, a kind of life review, and you're left free in the model that I learned to do that in any way. So I was on the top of a mountain, as it were, in California, doing my vigil, waiting all night for the sun to come up, and it's pretty hard trying to keep that focus. And then as the dawn came, I had this fantastic feeling of joy of the sun as the sun began to rise, because my vigil night was complete. And as that feeling, as I experienced that feeling, a little bird, like a little wren, flew in and perched really close to me, like 5 foot away. And she just looked at the sun and just sang a little heart out to the rising sun. And I felt we were just on the same page. I felt an immediate, kinship with this little wren, because that's what I was experiencing. I was experiencing my heart singing, and this little bird was singing its heart out. And there was a sense of like, well, we're brothers. We're brothers and sisters. This is, yeah. So I get us, and that was just being on my own for 3 or 4 days. In a vision quest. So that was a ritualized space. But I certainly connected. I came back from experiences, that experience and other experiences, with a subjective belief that we are connected with nature.
Yeah.
There are other brothers and sisters. We are connected to nature in a very deep way. And of course, this is what Indigenous people have been saying to the Western world. The Native Americans have been saying it, and all the other tribes that are documented often have said this, that actually the animals are our brothers and sisters. We're connected with them, and you can actually experience that quite easily, I think.
I love that story. It makes me want to hear the other story that you write about.
Yeah. Well,
can you tell us the other one?
Yeah, I think. Well, the other one in the book was it's where I get a letter from at the buddy pile from my mother, because the part of what I describe about in the book is being adopted, the story of my adoption, and what that did. It gave me an outsider perspective on the world, and I think that led me to connect with nature, and it led me to see nature and human culture, I suppose, from an outsider perspective. And over years of study, I've deepened that. Yeah. So part of the what happened on that vision quest also was, I did receive a letter from my mother about my birth family, and then which was it's a very powerful thing to get when I was out there. And then as I walked up the hill back to my site, I kicked this bit of metal on the ground. It was like a burst water pipe or something, and I couldn't understand why this pipe was out there in the middle of the desert. But I picked it up and brought it back. And then when I took it back after the quest, when I took it back and told my story, I showed them this pipe. And Stephen Foster, who's dead now, explained that actually this area used to be a target area during the Second World War. They used to fire their machine guns up and down the mountains. And what I found was the exploded armor-piercing bullet, and there was a very strong imaginal connection between my experience of being on the vision quest and reconnecting with my family, and that finding that armor-piercing bullet, which in a sense kind of opened up aspects of my life that I hadn't been in touch with before.
So at a metaphorical level, this experience was piercing your armor?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's, you
Yeah.
know, and I think when you talk to people who have been on vision quests, they come back with incredible stories. You know, they're stories which always have this quality of being intersubjective, but very heartfelt and heart opening experiences, and often very, very deeply connected with nature.
Yeah. So going back to your writing here, the use of nature-based developmental tools, such as vision quests, right?
Yeah.
Helps focus curiosity on the quality of underlying attachment patterns.
Mm-hmm.
The integration and mastery of the body and the threshold experience of systemic phase change or soul encounter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You said something about phase change earlier, and I guess I don't know that much about systems theory, although I feel drawn to it. And of course, it made me think of water turning into ice as an example of phase change.
Yeah, yeah. So the term, I mean, when you go back to this idea of a rite of passage, you know, when we think of it from a Western point of view, it can become quite crass. It could, you know, in our world, a rite of passage is getting drunk or passing your driving test or something like that. Whereas actually, when you think about nature, and you think about human beings in nature, and you think about the spiritual development of human beings, what appears to have happened in indigenous rites of passage when they're intact, and modern rites of passage when they're done really well, is that you're able to move on. You're able to move on in your life, and that could be from grief. It could be a recognition of a phase in your life which is finished, or whatever it is, the end of a piece of therapeutic work, or recognizing a new phase in life. And Bill Plotkin calls that he calls that soul initiation, the opening of the soul in a way. And sometimes we can get that experience. The experience that happens before that is soul encounter, which is a kind of aha moment, but it's not actually, you realize you need to change, but it hasn't actually transformed you in a way. And that transformation, when you think about that in terms of systems theory, as you say, with the cooling of water and freezing, you know, what can happen is things can change you. You can have experiences which take you towards a change, but you remain the same, like the cooling of the water. And there's a certain point where everything changes. You know, quite often people, they have a tragedy, or they have a health scare, and they say, that's it, I'm no longer going to drink, or I'm no longer going to eat red meat, and they change their life completely. And from a systems point of view, that's you know, you could describe that as a systemic phase change, where you were water, you're now ice. Something completely different. Something is completely. And I think in our weird culture, because we haven't got those rites of passage intact anymore, it's very difficult for us to change. So the whole story of the pollution of the earth, plastics, use of carbon, eating of meat, destruction of the environment, you know, we all know we need to change, but actually it's very difficult, you know, to get that systemic phase change is quite important, I think, that complete transformation.
Yeah. And so I gather in the process of doing these vision quests, leading vision quests, that's something you do with youth, right?
It's something I have done at the moment. Because I haven't done that for a little while, because I've actually been writing the book. That's been my main preoccupation. I've been thinking, you know, I'd like to do some more vision quest work, but actually what came back to me from my kind of imaginal aspect, I suppose, is write the book, finish the book. And that, you know, as I said, the book has been on my mind for a long time. So now So in a sense, for me, the book, writing the book is systemic phase change. Before I was not an author, and now I'm an author, and I'm in a different place.
Yeah.
And I have to think about, I have to sort of, I have the opportunity to organize my life slightly differently now, and it feels different. So, yeah.
Yeah, so there are different kinds of vision quests, and it was, in a sense, devoting yourself to this journey of writing the book was a kind of vision quest for you.
In a certain way, it was, yeah.
Yeah. And as you say,
and I suppose the other thing that comes out of Vision Quest, the teaching of the Vision Quest, is it's not about you; it's about what you can give away for other people. And this book, the book is very much, it's really gathering a lot of experiences that I've had in my life, a lot of opportunities I've had, that other people might not have the not have chance to, and putting them in a book which I hope is accessible to everyone. And as you say, I referenced it in a way that people who were, just coming from a weird culture, from a Western culture, could understand some of these more unusual ideas, like the imaginal, vision quest, phase change, soul encounter.
Yeah, that really impressed me about the book, is that I think if you had not referenced it as extensively as you have, it would have been easier for people to just kind of dismiss it. Oh yeah, that all sounds very romantic and fine.
Exactly. And I've read a lot of books like that. You think, wow, but actually, but what's interesting now, I think, and again, in terms of thinking about vision quest and phase change, we're in a stage now where this kind of work, this nature-based work, is in a different stage than it was 10 years ago. When I came back from training with Lost Borders 20 years ago, it was just some weird thing. There weren't many people doing it at all. There are a lot more in America, but in the UK there were very few. Now that's really growing, and an understanding of nature-based therapy is growing quite, it's growing quite fast. And there's a lot of evidence. So, I could reference it now because the evidence is there. There are a lot of people have written about this stuff.
Yeah, right. Towards the end of the passage that you read before, you said the next task seems to me to be the mastery of imaginal language and perspective. What if a person wants to master that perspective? How are they going to do it?
Well, I think the imaginal is quite a difficult thing to understand, and I suppose that an easy way in, which is an interesting route, is because the other person I reference in the book is Rudolf Steiner, who developed Steiner education. And what I discovered when I was doing my research is that Bateson and Henri Corbin, who talked about the imaginal, and Rudolf Steiner seem to be talking about the same thing. Although Steiner calls it the spiritual world, and that today that comes with quite a lot of baggage, so it's not a very good way of describing it. But one of the places that Steiner's work got picked up and translated was in the Star Wars films, and they describe the Force. And that idea, the idea of the force be with you. Can you feel the force? All that,
right?
Force is with you. That really is, from what I understand, comes from Steiner's work, because George Lucas's kids went to the Steiner school, and he was picking up a lot of these ideas.
Waldorf schools, right?
Yeah,
Waldorf.
Exactly. Waldorf. Yeah,
I've got three grandchildren who are in the Waldorf school.
Oh, are you? Where are they then?
Well, here in California.
Right, good. Yeah. Well, that's so thinking about the imaginal as the force is a useful start, because it's easy. It's in mainstream culture. We can think about that. But from a therapist's point of view, it's that in-betweeny space. It's that space. It's that kind of aha space where we get a breakthrough, and it's not it's not necessarily a thing. It's not necessarily a concept. It's just that feeling of like, oh yeah, I've got that. And once you get a feel for that as a therapist, then you get a sense of where you can find that in other places. But again, you have to push aside this conceptual world, which we're so embedded in Western culture, and the visual world, which is very much of our kind of screen culture. So it's kind of in between the screen culture and the conceptual world. But then if you go around, what's interesting is that's the culture we live in. But after work, people do all this imaginal stuff. They go to the gym, they do yoga, they do dance, they play music, they do cooking. And that really has a much more of this quality of the imaginal, the emergent, where you're working with something that comes out in between yourself and what you're working with. It has a poetic quality rather than...
Yeah, and it sounds like our play, our hobbies, maybe express the things that we do that are creative, may somehow be, and it reflect the hunger to go back to that sort of experience.
Yeah. And I'm kind of intrigued by this whole research into the polyvagal and the connection between the body and the autonomic, and how it comes bottom up. Again from Bessel van der Kolk's work and that kind of that again, when you work through the body, which is, again, I've been involved in that as well, in outdoor work, having kids outside. Something different happens than when you just talk about it. You can buy a cake or from a shop, but if you make a cake, there's a completely different experience you have to that cake.
Yeah. Well, this is probably a good place for us to wrap this up. Is there any sort of final thing that you'd like to say that encapsulates it for you?
Well, I thought because I want to finish it. I finished the book with a poem, the Rumi poem.
Yes, the Rumi poem. I read that. I loved it. We started with a reading. Let's end with a reading.
Let's end with a reading. Yeah. I'll see if I can read it as well as I've read the first bit.
Okay. So
this is the. So I think the reason I put this poem in here, because it describes this kind of ephemeral experience of working with the imaginal really clearly, and keeps it out of the conceptual. So the poem is Story Water. A story is like water that you heat for your bath. It takes messages between the fire and your skin. It lets them meet and it cleans you. Very few can sit down in the middle of the fire itself like a salamander or Abraham. We need intermediaries. A feeling of fullness comes, but it usually takes some bread to bring it. Beauty surrounds us, but we usually need to be walking in the garden to know it. The body itself is a screen to shield and partially reveal the light blazing inside your presence. Water, stories, the body, all the things we do are mediums that hide and show what's hidden. Study them and enjoy this being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not.
That's great. Yeah. Hey, Roger, thank you so much for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio, and it's been very enlivening.
Great. It's been great talking to you.
Likewise.
And keep up your fantastic work. It's a real inspiration.